I can tell you that I get comments and feedback from all over the world. People listen to it and watch it. So in your schools, we're changing the world. Okay. I just got a letter. That was just because yesterday I just got a note from someone, of all places, in Greece. Not a Jewish guy. At least that's what he thinks. He writes to me that he is avidly following. He can't wait to hear the next Sefira, which is Sefiros Yesod. So I welcome people from Greece and from everywhere in the world, and of course all of you here. So as you know, from the beginning of the year, I began all the way from Lifnei Tzimtzum, where we always begin, and we're down now into Atzilus, which is a smaller madrega l'fiyarach, even though the Alter Rebbe would tremble, even when he couldn't even say the word Atzilus. And in Atzilus itself, we went through the Sefiros, and up to now, the 9th Sefira, Yesod. The previous Shiurim was Netzach and then Hoid, and now comes Yesod, and of course will be followed by Malchus. So, as I've been doing throughout the whole series, besides giving some form of overview and explanation of the actual darga level we're talking about, but also its importance in the whole scheme of Seder Shtalshus, like why is it needed? If you didn't have it, Eibishter didn't make it, didn't have to make it. It means it's a necessary piece in the puzzle, in the structure, and necessary primarily also for us to understand how the Eibishter creates existence in a logical way, as much as we can, and as well as how we connect to the Eibishter through Aveda. So there has to also be a bechein, a lesson Aveda from each of these levels, what it means practically in our lives, applying it to our lives. And I've also been doing it like microcosm, macrocosm, what this, let's say the Sefira, in this case Yesod, is on its target, but also what it reflects on the bigger picture in Agili Elokus. What's the Elokus that's revealed dafka through Yesod and not through Netzach or Heid or the others. Because each one of the Sefiros obviously reveals to us, begin d'shtamuden beit, the Zohar says. The Eibishter is Megal the Sefiros in order for us to know him. And to get to know someone, you have to know all their facets. Just like when he talks about you talk about a human being, how do you get to know a person? Through their faculties, their intelligence, their midas, their emotions, and then you break that down further. So the same thing is that we look at the Adam HaTachten, from that we learn from the Adam Elyon, we get to know God, so to speak. So that's just a general picture. And the Sefiros particularly, just to review and sum up what I've already explained, but I'll just say it again, is the actual building blocks. So the elements are like the dimensions, Atzilus, Bri, Yetzir, Asiyah, and we'll discuss the other elements as we continue. In each elam, there's the building blocks. So each elam is a darga, and then in the darga itself, there's the pieces. And what are the pieces? Chochmah through, Keser, but Chochmah through Malchus. And then, of course, in each elam, Chochmah through Malchus, Chochmah, Bina, Das, etc., through Malchus, goes through its own darga. Chochmah Vatzilus is different than Chochmah Debriya, which we shall discuss as well. So we're up to Yesod, as I said. So let's go back to the Geras HaKedesh. Since the Alter Rebbe does spell out these Sefiros to some extent, let's begin with there. It's a good flow. As we read through the Alter Rebbe in Siman Tezvav in the Geras HaKedesh, where he brings out closer, use Sefiros Sheben Nishmas HaAdam, Neideh Lekeil, Shamidas Nechlokes B'derech Klal Zayim Midas, V'chol Prat HaMidas Shebodem Bois Ma'achas Mezayim Midas Elu, Shein Sheirish Kol HaMidas V'Kloluson Shein Midas HaChesed, and he goes through from Chesed through Malchus. So we went through all of those, especially last was Netzach and Heid, the Kleis Yetzes, and then the aspect of Netzach being to Menatzeich, Lamed Neged Kol Minea. So the Alter Rebbe's context here in Tanya is Hashpah. That's his moshel, which makes total sense, because what is the Inyan of the Sefiros anyway? It's Hashpah of Elokus to create. So the best example for it is the classic, maybe the most famous example of all, from the Alter Rebbe Chassidus, is Mashpia and Mekabel, Harav and a Talmud. Because there you can learn all the key ingredients and necessary elements in how you mashpia. So obviously you need Chabad, but then you need Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chet. So he explained in that context of a mashal of Mashpia Mekabel, that's what Alter Rebbe is explaining in Siman Tezvov, each of the Sefiros, particularly the Midas. It doesn't really talk about Chabad, if I recall correctly. Yeah, it talks about the Midas. So we're up to, I'm going to read inside from Ageres HaKedesh, and then we'll analyze it, we'll explain it. Okay, so now, here we go. Ubchinas Yesod. So, if you recall in Tanya, it's both, the mashal is actually a twofold. Mashpia and Mekabel, but also Av and Ben, which is also another dimension of Mashpia and Mekabel. So he's been talking throughout Av and Ben, by when he spoke about Netzach and Heid, how to be Mesader and Inyan, how the Av prepares himself to Mashpia to the Ben. So now he said, what's Yesod in this context? Hu al derech mashal, hayiskashrus, shemekasher ha'av sichlei b'seichel b'nei. So the mashal is how iskashrus, maybe the best way to translate it would be bonding, or connecting, or attachment. Mekasher ha'av, that he connects himself, he attaches himself with a kesher, his mind. The Av is mekasher, his mind, b'seichel b'nei, in the mind of his child. B'shas l'mudei imei, ba'ava v'rotzen. So in other words, he's not just learning with him superficially, open up a sefer, let's read together. He connects himself with him. He bonds. You could have both a fan. You could have someone that's teaching an Av, but is doing it as a, to Yetzer Zayin. And it's done more chetzenizdik. Here he's told shemekasher Av b'shas l'mudei imei, and he explains why, because it's ba'ava, but it's v'rotzen, it's with love and desire. Shereitze sheyevin b'nei, because he wants his child to understand what's being taught. In other words, if he didn't connect himself, he just read it quickly, will the child really go away with a full understanding? So in other words, he say this Chassidus is negate to the Havana. Netzach and Heid, he spoke, was more negate to how you prepare the idea and how you present the idea. The Kleis Yesod. Yesod is the etzem iskashrus, that he wants him to understand it. And he continues. Ubilodezeh. And if there was not this iskashrus, this Yesod, im hoya haben shemei diburim elu atzmo mepi ovav, if the child, the son, would hear these words, same ideas, on his own, from the mouth of his father. In other words, his father is speaking, but not necessarily directed to him, or not necessarily bonding with him. Maybe his father is speaking at the table and everybody's listening. He doesn't say this explicitly, but just al derech zeh. Shemedaber ba'adei v'leimed la'atzmei. This is in the parentheses. It says here in Tanya that the Ksaviyad of the Tzemach Tzedek, he removed these words. But in the parentheses here, in the brackets, it says, Shemedaber ba'adei v'leimed la'atzmei. In other words, the father is speaking, but the son is, probably leimed la'atzmei means the father is learning on his own, and the son is maybe listening in. That's what it sounds like. Shemedaber ba'adei v'leimed la'atzmei. Not positive. But regardless, it's definitely not biskashrus of Av l'bnei. So, bilodei zeb, in other words, without this Yesod iskashrus, lo yoyeh mevin kol kach, kumei achshav she'ovev mekasher sichlei elav. So in that case, he would have understood it, because the father explains the idea, and he's listening, he'll understand it, but he won't understand it kol kach. Kumei achshav, like now, which means achshav here means when there is Yesod, she'ovev mekasher sichlei elav, where his father is binding his seichel to him, I should say. Umedaber imei, and speaks with him ponim el ponim, face to face. In other words, it's personal, and it says kashrus. Ba'ava, and now he has v'cheshek, v'shecheshek me'ed sheyavin b'nei. So it's with love and cheshek, passion, that he desires deeply, or much, that his child should understand. V'kol ma shecheshek v'ataynu gadol, and the greater the cheshek, the passion and the pleasure, kacha hashpah v'alimud gadol. In direct proportion to that will be the transmission, and the limud will be greater. Shaben yuchel lekabel yesod, that the child will be able to receive more. Va'av mashpia yesod, and the father will be mashpia more. Because the cheshek and tainug in this iskashus, this passion and pleasure, misnabe, it expands, and makes grow. It could be kamas anechus maybe. Sichle, his mind, barchoves hadas, an expansion of the das of hashpia, ulalamid libnei, to transmit and to teach his son, his child. Still not over. It's a pretty big arichas, just on Yesod. So then he adds in a parentheses, and I think that concludes it. Let me see. I think so. It says, Ukamoyel derech moshul begashmias, mamish, ribui hazera, humerei v'cheshek v'atainuk. Like we see begashmias, because Yesod, as you know, in the physical manifestation is the reproductive organ of the male, Yesod, from which comes the zera, the seed. So he says, so we see begashmis. That's also ashpa. We'll talk about Yesod and Malchus, Zocher, Nekeva, but those the ashpa, Yesod is mashpia. So here, so until now we're talking about ashpa sasechel. Now he's talking about the actual ashpa of Yesod, of actually providing the seed of life that will give birth to a child. Like, we'll talk about Das a little later, because seemingly very similar asis in Pei Gimel and Tanya. But let's continue here. So what do you see begashmi is that riboy hazera that comes from Yesod, humerei v'cheshek v'atainuk. It comes from great passion and pleasure. If a person doesn't have that, there won't be any emission of any seed. Like we learned in Tanya and Pei Beis, where he says that the zera comes from betipas meyach ha'av. So through this, you mamshech from the meyach. And that's why the Chachmei Emes, meaning the Mekubalim, compared this to Azivu Gashmi, this Yichud, this Iskashus of Yesod and Malchus, as shall be explained. I think he does explain it later. Yeah, this the Pedic is far from over. I just want to quickly look if anything more Nigel in Yonenu here. I don't think so. Okay. I mentioned before about Chabad. I want to correct that at the end, he does go back to, I believe, to Das. Okay. So that covers Yesod. Now, there's a lot to unpack here because the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe clearly elaborates ba'arichas what Yesod is, and it's quite clear as well. So Yesod, what does it add? It adds an element of iskashus. That's the key word here. In other words, if you had chesed, gvura, teferes, and etzachayid, and malchus, you wouldn't have iskashus, like he says clearly. Take away the iskashus doesn't mean the mekabel, in this case, B'nai, the child will not receive, but he won't receive, like he said, he won't understand it as well, and it won't be with all the depth. And the gadlus, like he said, the ashpo v'alimid gadol, mesabes b'nad the sichle, it won't be with that expansiveness. And we see this begashmis, poshet begashmis. I'm sure you've had teachers, or parents for that matter, if your father, even though the example is a father, it could also be a mother technically, but whoever the mashpia was, if he cared to invest himself in you and sat with you and allowed you to ask questions, and you could see that he connected himself with you, it's a very different type of learning experience than when you have someone who does a job. Say they don't teach. I'm not talking about someone that calls not mashpia is not mashpia, but the mashpah is more makif and doesn't leave the same impact. I mean, many ways, just to drive the point home. Yud Shvat Tov Shelamed Zion. It was Yutas Kisel that year. The Rebbe came out with renewing the inyan of mashpiyim. The whole sikha in Yutas Kisel Lamed Zion. It's actually the sikha right before the Rebbe then announced that we're going to print for the first time Ayin Beis. So the Rebbe said, Rosh Hashanah Chassidus, Dafen Fort Epestam for Chassidus. And the Rebbe spoke about Mashpiyim, how was a Yesod Ikri from the Alter Rebbe's times and all the years, but for whatever reason was not able to fully take hold because of the time of the Rebbe Rashab, the upheavals. So now's the time to renew it. And the Rebbe spoke about it relatively barichas, but he continued, not just Yutzes Kislev, spoke about Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and then Yud Shvat was a long arichas. There's one thing that I want to just point out that Mamish is, I think, can really help understand what we're discussing here. So the Rebbe said, Mashpia comes from the word Shefa. So Chassidus explains what's the difference between Shefa and Oyer. So we learn about it in so many Maimorim. And Bechlal, the Maimorim talk about the Malyusa of Oyer over Shefa. That Oyer is Me'ein HaMoyer, it's bottled to the Moyer. It doesn't have any Metzias, Atzmei, like sunlight. There's no sun, there's no sunlight. Mashenkin Shefa is already nifred from the Mashpia. When you give someone Hashpah, like let's say Hashpah Sasechel, first of all, the Sechel of the Talmud is not created by the Rav, and even by the father, even though it comes originally from the father, but once a child's a child, he's a Metzias La'atzmei, he's a separate entity. And what he receives from his father, he doesn't need to be dependent. Even when he leaves, the Hashpah remains with you. So Shefa is not Dovuk L'Mekede, is the Lashon Chassidus. Not attached. It's like being mashpia, like I pour you a cup of water. It's also hashefa. But it's not, the water is no longer connected to the source. When it comes to Oyer is Moyer, Oyer and Meina Moyer, and Dovuk L'Moyer, and all that. So the Rebbe spoke here that when you say mashpia, you don't say he's a Moyer. You call him a mashpia. Because the kavanah of a mashpia is not to remain detached. Because one of the milas and chesenis of Oyer and Moyer, compared to Mashpia and Shefa, is Moyer and Oyer, even though the Oyer is muchach to the Moyer, but the Oyer remains detached from where it goes. For example, sunlight, this is the example, the sun will shine on a pile of garbage equally to on a palace, because the light is not affected by the place it's going to. It's purely Mamayl Lamata, it's Oyer that's Meir, and that's it. It doesn't have to be Mislabish Lefi Akeli. Shefa is the exact opposite. The whole mile of Shefa is that it goes into the container and it's affected by the Keli. So Oyer is not affected by the place it shines. And Mashpia should be affected, and the Rebbe said that's what a Mashpia is. He's not made from Makif, and he's shining Oyer, Mamayl Lamata. He's not sitting basically in an ivory tower and being Mamshech Hamshoches. That's the yin of Moyer. But that's not the yin of a Mashpia. Mashpia has to be, Mamish, the words of the Alter Rebbe, has to be mislabish, bislapshus, and an infant that of mekasher, b'seichel b'nei, b'shas limudei, and it's b'tacheshek and tainug. In other words, it's without that type of focus and investment, you're not going to have the full connection. So essentially, with that said, Yesod provides us with another element which is vital, because let's go back to the Avedis Hashem aspect. If we want to have a connection to the Eibishter, you can have a connection Be'efem Makifi. You can even have a connection Be'efem Pnimi in an internal way through Chesed. The Eibishter shows us love, and we show the Eibishter love. But here we're talking from the Mashpia to the Makabel. Kvura, Teferes, Netzach, Ched. Yesod adds that there's a Skashas Pnimi from Mashpia to the Makabel. In the case in Avedis Hashem would be between the Eibishter and us. So it's like when the Eibishter says, Atav v'chatonim v'kol ha'amim, or the Eibishter was mislabish himself to take us out of Mitzrayim, to give us the Torah. It's not just Be'efem Makif. It's Eifem of Iskashrus. So that's that. And in Bein Adam L'Chaverei, it teaches us the key to our relationship is not just that you love someone, or you revere them, that's Gvura, or you have compassion, Tiferes, and Netzach and Heid and the other Midas, but there's also Iskashrus Pnimi, between you and the person that you have a relationship with. In modern psychological terms, and I'm not borrowing this from psychology, the opposite. I think psychology takes it from Chassidus, whether they know it or not, that there's an element of, in a relationship that often is lacking, is the ability to bond with somebody. So there are many people that are very fine people, they're good people, they're giving people, and they can have chesed and gvura, teferes, and other midas, but bonding is a whole different story. And this brings me to why it's called Yesod. Because the Cheda, why isn't it called Hiskashrus? What's that Yesod? If the whole Inyan is Hiskashrus, then it should be called Kesher, or you find some word. What's Yesod? Yesod means a foundation. And what do you say in the bracha, that the biggest bracha you give to Achas and Kala, the Rebbe's letter to our wedding? The boy, Binyan Adayad, Miyusod. I'll say that Tereva mitzvahs. In other words, the word Yesod is used because, think of a building. What is a building like if you don't have a foundation? So you can have beautiful floors, and you can have all kinds of Chassidus and powerful elements, not just Chassidus even. But if you don't have a foundation, it's not lasting. You can't call it a binyan adayad. Call it a binyan maybe, but it won't last. Another interesting, Yesod is also invisible. You don't see it, because under the ground. And nevertheless, without it, no building can stand. What does that mean in Midas Adam? That you could have all the Midas, but if there isn't that full commitment and full connection, then the relationship is really tremendously compromised. I mean, just to put it a little more in contemporary terms, I was just a few weeks ago, I was on a radio interview, and it was about the reversal. The Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade. And if you don't know what that is, Tovei Aleichem Bracha, like the Rebbe said by Fabrengens many times, he would say, as the New York Times writes, and he says, if you don't know what the New York Times is, Tovei Aleichem Bracha. Okay, so Roe versus Wade was a Supreme Court decision made 49 years ago about legalizing and giving every person the constitutional right for an abortion. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but my point that I was on the radio, I said, well, the issue to me is not abortion. The issue is commitment in relationships. The idea that a husband and wife, a man and woman, choose to come together, and a sacred union is not just that they come together, they're physically together. The Rambam writes, Isha Poga, Isha B'shuk, that's not Kedushin. Kedushin means sanctity, and sanctity means commitment. It's a sacred commitment, and that commitment includes, and the Eibishter gave Ve'evarach, Kururuvu, the ability to have a child, and the child actually creates the commitment even deeper, because when a father and mother have a child, their bond is now complete. It's not just two people who decided to be together. So the whole idea is that we're living in a time, I mean, I'm just pointing out that I didn't use the words from Tanya here and the Aces of Chassidus, but I said the biggest problem is we don't have a society that considers commitment sacred. So what's the idea? That, okay, fine, we're not talking about abortion in circumstances that are Pi Halacha allowed because of Pekuach Nefesh or whatever the heter would be. The point is that you come together, there are consequences of a relationship. One of them is having a child. I don't even want to call it consequences, it's a bracha. The fact that we don't see this as a blessing, we see, the relationship, we just want to enjoy each other, enjoy ourselves, and just have pleasure without commitment is essentially a relationship without Yesod. Everything could be there. You could have Ava and Yira, you could have all the Midas. I'm talking Pashut, even in a Balbatsha Grobe language even. But there's no commitment. So Yesod is the foundation. That's why it's called foundation, because with Hiskashrus you have something that is forever. It's not a commitment just when it's convenient. That's what a true marriage is. And I say marriage because it's the best example. First of all, you say that Malchus is essentially Zachar Nekeva, like he says in the parentheses about the Zera. But in a broader sense, it adds the element of building something. And until a person doesn't get married, and they don't build a family, you cannot say they really have Yesod in their life, in the sense of building a foundation, something with a strong foundation. And that's why you say binyan adayad, you say that tereva mitzvah, the word Yesod is used, because Yesod means an eternal and an eternal and sustainable and perpetual connection. This is essentially in simple English what the Alter Rebbe is saying. He's saying in that language of Av B'nei, in a mashpia, but that's the same idea. What's a real mashpia? What's the real, that there's a kasher. He even gives the example of bilodezeh, what it would be like without it. Without it, you'd have some mashpah. No one's denying that. But it wouldn't have this bonding element. And I can tell you that today, from my own personal experience, counseling people and so on, it's one of the biggest dilemmas. People even good people are afraid to bond, what they call commitment issues. They're ready to be there, but it's always with some conditions. The idea of saying, I'm in all the way. And it's interesting, we even use the expression iskashus by chassid and a rebbe, right? Iskashus of a chassid to a rebbe. What's iskashus mean? It's also iskashus from the rebbe to the chassid. So we know iskashus is not just you are committed and say, okay, the rebbe will tell me something, I'll do it, even if it's inconvenient. It's a fundamental kesher pnimi, a kesher chazak. It's something that you can never destroy. It's not like conditional, that one day when you're in the mood, you're iskashus, and one day you're not. The whole meaning of true iskashus is that you're all the way in, just like a soldier in an army. There's no way out. And I say it l'mal yused, not like we're stuck, punkt faket. Total commitment. I think I mentioned maybe one of the shiurim, I just saw it in the Sefer Mamorim Yiddish. Even though I don't know if I would apply it to Yesod, but it's interesting, I just want to mention it. In Sefer Mamorim Yiddish, so the Frierdiker Rebbe, of course, translates a lot of musagim, concepts of Chassidus in Yiddish. So how does he translate bittul? I always struggle with how do you explain bittul to people? We know what batel b'shishim means. It's nullified, or it's annihilated. Bittul biur chometz is bittul mevatel, but that's of course in the negative. How do you explain the keich habittul that Chassidus talks about? The bittul of a neshama, the bittul of a person, bittul hayesh, bittul mitzias. So I have my words that I use, modesty, humility, suspending yourself. There's a lot of interesting words you could use. The Frierdiker Rebbe actually says bittul, he says ibegegebenkeit. Ibegegebenkeit. And he says koyach bittul is the craft from ibegegebenkeit. Ibegegebenkeit means devotion, dedication, commitment. Essentially he's teaching bittul as devotion. And koyach bittul is the art. Craft in Yiddish means like an art, the craft, or the art of devotion. I found it quite interesting. So I'm only mentioning it because it has a similarity to what we're talking about, iskashus. So it has that element of bittul. I wouldn't say Yesod in Yoni, calling Yoni is bittul, but you can understand a person with ego is not going to find it easy to be mekasher himself to someone else. Why would a father come down and say, I can learn on my own, what do I have to invest my whole energy to my makabel, to my benoi, to my child? So there's no question iskashus requires bittul. So that, I think, is somewhat of a little more explanation and application of Yesod. So firstly, we understand its importance, not just its critical importance, because it adds the element of true iskashus. Whether it's between ourselves, between people, husband and wife, between mashpia and makabel, av b'nei, or between the Eibishter and us. So it adds the element of iskashus. And that's why you'll see the word Yesod is always used in that way. The second thing, we also understand what it means in Avedis Hashem. You could have, you're committed, but you don't have a Yesod commitment, which means a fundamental aspect of it. The next thing I want to cover is this, that Yesod is in Kavam Tzoi. This is interesting as well, of course, and it makes total sense. Because here we have like this, what do we say? This Yamin, Smail, and Emtza. So Chochmah, Bina is Yamin and Smail, right and left. Das is in middle, that's in Moichin, like right, left, and center brain. Then you have in the first midas, Chesed to the right and Gvura to the left, and Sefiros in the middle. We spoke about Mavriach min HaKotza LaKotza, that runs and extends from one extreme to one end to the other of the spectrum. And then now in the third lower midas, Netzach is to the right and Hey to the left, and Yesod is in the middle, as well as Malchus will be in the middle. So let's talk a bit about that. Why is Yesod in the middle? Well, first of all, even Pasha Begashmis. If you remember, we talked about Sefiros is like the spine. The spine of a human being, the Shidra, Chut HaShidra, is critical because it really holds up the whole structure. Chmon al-Islam, if something happens to a person's spine, you can't walk properly. Even though you could have all the entire skeleton, other bone structures all in place, the spine is like the center. It's like in a building. There are beams. I don't know if you ever see construction. So when they do construction, they always look which are the Yesod beams that you can't just remove. There are beams that you can remove. You can extend the wall. You can break down. But there are beams that are like hold up the whole building. So Yesod, in that sense, is like the extension of the spine of Sefiros that runs all the way from Keser through Das, through Sefiros, through Yesod to Malchus. In the example of the Moshel of the Mishkan, so the Brichim that attached walls, they connected one wall to the next, but what kept a balance, a centrifugal balance as they call it, to the entire walls, that they also be balanced? Not walls could be wobbly if they don't have one pillar or one briach, one what do we call it, one beam that runs across. That's mavriach min hakotza lekotza. So Tiferes has to go somewhere, so it goes up das to Kesed, and down Yesod and Malchus. Now in context of what we spoke about, it makes total sense, because his Chassidus is not necessarily purely just an amida as in the Chesed, it's also a amida that connects things. It's connecting the higher and the lower. So that's where it belongs. If Yesod was right or left, it would have a role to play, but it wouldn't be a connector. It's in the center, means that it's going to connect the higher levels and lower levels in a full fashion. And that's essentially what a foundation is about. So the foundation is under the building, the entire building. Then the building itself could have a right wing and a left wing and a center and all that. But the foundation has to be in the center of it all, which also explains how the Eibishter created the human body. The human body, going back to the reproductive organs, are in the center, because they are not just physically in the center, they also are the center of life. They bear life, and they give life, and that's why it belongs there. So you say, Ein kishe elo das, for example. So Chassidus explains why. Because das is in the center. Das connects all the way to Kesed, and when you need to have hashpah, like he says here, hashpah, that should be the ribui hazera, in order to provide the seed of life, to give life, you can't just rely on hamshacha that is somewhat limited. Chesed, gvura, and right and left don't go all the way down or up. So here you're talking about a hamshacha that goes, like it says, yedek kechetz, like it's intense and it's able to be mamshech. And when you want focus like that, like laser beam focus, it has to be very powerful. So Yesod requires that type of, like talk about a spine, a solid, strong foundation that goes from the top all the way down to the bottom. So that's briefly a little about the Yesod in its so-called, the central component in it. Okay, so now, with that said, let me see here, if anything I wanted to add any more from what he says here. So, to apply it a bit to speak a little more in Aveda, I remember once, just give an example, a case study. So I was, one of my shiurim I was giving in Manhattan, a lot of secular people would come. So once a couple came over to me, and they told me they were dating. They wanted to talk to me privately after the class, so we sat down and spoke. They're dating already 4 years or something like that. And it comes a point, how long can you date? She wants to get married, and he's still holding out. So would I be willing to speak to him privately? And he said he'd love to, he doesn't, So we met in the Grand Army Plaza one afternoon, and just me and him, very smart guy, a computer genius type, and a very sweet guy. And you go through the usual suspects, like I said, so what's the story? Maybe you tell me man to man, like eye to eye, what's the story here? I mean, you're dating for so long, you continue to date. He says, no, I would want to marry her. So he says, but I don't have that 100% need to push. Meanwhile, we're just together, and that's that. And I couldn't get to the bottom of it. So first I asked him, how were your parents' marriage? Usually they call the usual suspects. There's a list of things you have to always go through. How were your parents' marriage? Often a parent's marriage is not so good. It affects people not ready to get married. They're afraid of it. They didn't see love in their lives. They're insecure. Anyway, we went through, everything checked out. He didn't have any trauma in his life. He didn't have anything that I would say would indicate a good reason why he would. Now, if he said he doesn't like her, he wants to break up with her, it's one thing. He didn't say that. He wants to be with. Anyway, as we're talking, something struck me, and I said to him, I don't think your problem is with this woman or this dating. I think you have in general, is there anything in your life that you're absolutely committed to all the way, that you would die for? And I don't mean begashmis chas v'shalom to die, but you're ready to fight for without any options, unconditional. And he thinks about it for a minute, and he says, no, not really. I've always lived my life, always kept my options open, always have a back door. I've never been committed to anything 100%. I mean, of course, the point is to himself, I'm sure he is committed 100%. I didn't have to emphasize that. But he's committed to his non-commitment. That's also a commitment. I don't know if I'd call that Yesod, but so fine. And he said, then he turns to me, I mean, this is not really the part of the story I want to share, but I have to share it because it's negated to the Hemshech. So he says to me, what about you? What are you committed to like that, Which is fine. I like being challenged. I have no problem. If I'm asking a question, when they say when you ask a question, you dish it out, you have to be ready to take it too. So I said, fine. So I don't know, something struck me, and I told him, I'm committed. I could tell you right now what I'm committed to. But I reminded myself, and again, this is not negay at all to the Yanenu, I'm just sharing it about Mitzad Shleimus Ha'inyan. I said to him, I remember when I was a child, and I went to yeshiva, so I was in Bedford and Dean, the famous Bedford and Dean. Yeah, I'm one of the old timers. So Bedford and Dean was on exactly that. It was on Bedford Avenue, Dean Street. Now there's already a revival there, but to my days, it was, unfortunately, the yeshiva had to close down because it was terrible. There was a tax. I mean, we then moved to Ocean Parkway in Tufshin Lamed. But the years before that, I lived on a place called Sullivan Place. I don't even know where it is, near Nostrand Avenue. If you go down Nostrand, there's a small street that starts Sullivan. I think there's some people living there, Jews have moved back there. Okay, without going into my whole child history, so sometimes I would take the bus on Rogers to the yeshiva. Sometimes I would walk. When it rained, and this is what the story I'm telling him, I said, when it rained, I liked to walk, not because I liked rain. I had this Meshuggah quirk. Everybody has their quirky stuff, and I also had something. I know this is going far from the class on Yesod, but you'll see in a minute where I'm going. We need a little sometimes a milsa de b'dichas, right? To open up the minds of the Talmidim. So I said I had this crazy, quirky thing, which I never really shared with anyone, but since you're asking me, that I would walk by the edge of the street, the water runs down when it rains down the curb, and it goes into the sewer. And I had this mishagas that I would like to always clean out, like if I saw paper or dust or leaves, to open up a path to let the water run all the way. Sometimes the water gets blocked. You just have to open it up. No big chiddush. I didn't charge for it. There wasn't a great service to mankind. It was just my own, they call it idiosyncrasy, mishagas. And I said, when your question you asked me, and you asked from your heart, so it just came to mind, this memory. And I said, that's what I'm committed to. That's my Yesod. I didn't say the word Yesod. I said, because today I do exactly the same thing. I just don't do it in the streets. That I've matured, I've grown out of that. But I do it psychologically. I have a certain deep passion, what he calls Yecheshek v'tainug, to help people clear out the blocked passages in their psyche and in their emotions and things like that. That's what I do. And obviously I learned from the Rebbe and I learned from Chassidus how you do that well. How you help people who have, everyone has a block. We call it Mitzrayim, Mitzorim v'Gvulim. Some people, their block is fear. Some it's insecurity. Some people have their past histories. Everybody has stuff. And I'm sure you do too, but I'm not going into group therapy here, so I'm not going to get into details. But everybody has their stuff. And if you can help somebody just get rid of a block, an obstacle, I think that is well worth it. I told this to him. I said, what, till today, I'm ready now, it's now 40 years later. When I met him, probably around 40 years later. And I'm still doing that, and I still have that commitment. I'll tell you what happened. He started crying. This guy, he said to me, that's beautiful. I wish I had something that I could say I'm ready to fight for. The long story short, I will tell you, I planted a seed in him. And a little while later, they announced, they told me, they invited me to their wedding. They got married. Today they have a few children. I meet them from time to time. They're still in Manhattan still. Beautiful mishpacha. Today they're Shemri Shabbos, Shemri Teda Mitzvah. And what I wanted to say is because to me this was a perfect example of lack of Yesod and having Yesod in your life. He was a great guy, and she was a great person too. But he was like, whatever it was, I don't know what was blocking him, and frankly I never really figured out, it didn't make a difference to me. The point was, he needed to hear that, you're not committed to anything. And unfortunately we live in a world where many people suffer from this. very talented people. But either it's fear, or they're keeping their options open. You know, I met someone who was 75, still single. So I said, what's going on? He says, I'm keeping my options open. Okay, you know, he'll be 100 soon, he'll still have options. Okay, it sounds very nice. When you're 20, it sounds good. Not when you're 75. I mean, I didn't say that to him, but you get the idea. And there is a fundamental lack of in Yesod. You know, in Sforim, not Sifrei Chassidus, the Rebbe mentions it a few times. It speaks about that the reason for the Arichas HaGolus is the Avera of Shmiras Habris, being Eivra on Shmiras Habris. The Rebbe brings that this is not something Chassidus talks about so much. There are other Sifrei Musar and Chassidus that talk. Chassidus' approach has always been bring more Eir and it's Deicha Cheshech, Yedua, when it came to these inyanim. Shmiras Habris, of course, is the level of Yosef, is Yesod. Shmiras HaYesod. So Kabbalah explains why, because in order, before we get to the Elef HaShvi, Mashiach Geula, which is Malchus, the Midah HaShvis, you have to go through Midah HaShishis. So the last challenge is in the area of sexuality. And you start to see that in our generation. It's one of the biggest challenges today, the Hefkedus, and so on. Not that it wasn't a challenge earlier, but in many ways you could see much more promiscuity and much more a lack of Yesod. But it's not. So I remember once I was asked to give a talk on this topic, and I said, look, I come from Chabad, and I'm not comfortable, not beside the topic, I have no problem talking about the topic, but the Derech HaChassidus is to talk more on the positive. So if you don't mind, I'm going to speak about Yesod, but I'll speak about it in a way that's much more global. And I said, what's the real problem in sexuality? Is it the purely Shmiras Habris? Is it this Aveda, the Chet HaYedua, Chatas Neurim, etc.? Or something much deeper? It's a misunderstanding and a distortion of what commitment is. The whole point, if you read the end of Perek Zayin, when the Alter Rebbe explains the difference between Bias Asuris and that Chet, so he says clearly that the whole point of it is that it's this idea of it's just a person just indulging in their own pleasure. Not they're getting now into all the tumah that comes from it. That's already a tetzah. Whereas a relationship means that you are committed to another person, and yes, by all means, be intimate in a kosher and kedushadik way. That's what Yesod is. It's a solid foundation, and build a foundation, build a family, and so on. So the real challenge in our time is not just sexuality is a symptom. When you don't have real commitments to the things you should have, and you don't understand sanctity and kedusha and what it means to be connected to the Eibishter and to a cause and to a life, and at the end of the day to a family. What is it? It's not just you're married to someone, you're committed to her or to him. You're committed to building a family, to leaving a mark in this world, to building a bais vad l'chachamim, a home, an environment that you're going to bring kedusha and alakus to this world. So it's really a commitment challenge. A commitment issue is what's lacking here. Rather than just, and if you can fix the commitment issue, I guarantee you it'll help fix the sexual issues that people are challenged with. And I have to tell you, this was an audience that was not receptive at all, but they heard that, because that's something you can work on. So when we teach what Torah is, what Chassidus is, I talked about Iskashtas Tareb, it's not just a nice vort. It's not about you. Life is not about you. Yesod teaches you that life is about a connection to another. Why would a father say, like I said before, he's a big Talmud Chacham. He could sit and learn on his own, up Tzadik in Peltz, famous story with the Mittler Rebbe, right? He didn't hear the child cry, and Alter Rebbe said to him, how is that possible? And he was busy. What was the Mittler Rebbe doing? He wasn't busy doing something, Chaz v'Sholom. He was learning Torah. He says, you learn Torah and you don't hear a child cry. That means something's missing. What's missing? It's about you. And the whole point is not about you. There's a connection to a cause. And how could you not hear a child cry? The Alter Rebbe went Yom Kippur to go help that woman, the Yeledis, and so on. All these are a demonstration of his kashrus to something. It's not about you. So where that captured more than any other sphere, that's Yesod. It's the idea of a connection. You're committed to something, and it's permanent commitment, and with not forced. It's not bal karchach. It's like he says, it's on the adrabah. When you have a kesher like that, that's when you have ava and cheshek. Or either way, the ava v'cheshek brings the kesher, or the kesher brings the ava v'cheshek. Here it seems like it looks like the ava v'cheshek brings the kesher. But regardless, the point is that it is one that's with love and with passion, and it's a complete that you're committed to something that's not yourself. That's the key to the whole thing. And when that's the midas hayesod in the broadest sense. So then when you think of it in terms of yesod as in shmiras habris, and yesod as in terms of on a sexual level, like it says, zivu gashmi, that's an expression of it. When the commitment is there, b'meila, a person will deal with it. I was speaking to a group of bochrim many times, but especially recently, I got a fabrengen, and they started asking me, they know I talk openly about things, obviously in a tzniusdik way, in an edel way, and so they were comfortable to bring up their challenges. And I said to them, the issue is not, obviously everyone has taivas and everyone's going to have messianis. That's the way God created us. There's even a sikh in Teira Shalom about this, which is not for now, I'll talk about it another time. In Teira Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab has all sikha. Yechof Aleph Kislev, I think it's Ayin Gimel, where he talks about that if a person doesn't have a taiva, there's a problem with that. That's what he says. And he says the tikkun for this Aveda is learning Chassidus, because Chassidus touches, he says, the atzmius of a person, very much the AC, I don't know if he uses the word Yesod, he definitely uses the word brisei. He talks about chilul brisei from, they sang Podev Shalom, so the sikh is around that. I gave a few shurim on that. You can find it online if you know what online is. But the point I want to make is that so I was speaking to this bochum, and I said to them, I'm not going to discuss with you what you do when you have a taiva. The Rebbe says, haschadas, which everyone thinks means think about something else. It's more than that. It means concentrate on something else. Das is also iskashus, remember. I'll get to, I didn't have time to talk about it today, but we'll talk about das and yesod. Das is basically iskashus in mechin, yesod is iskashus in midas. That's the essential difference. But the point is, it's also, iskashus means connect yourself to something. I said, when you don't have iskashus to things that are kedusha and alakus, of course you're going to follow. Taivas are going to be easier. So I said, the best preemptive solution is you're so busy with something that's very powerful connecting to you. So that's where your iskashus is. Are you going to sometimes have a taiva? Listen, people have taivas. I'm not going into that. But the best preemptive solution is not sur merah. To sit all day and say, how am I going to prevent myself from doing an aveda? I'd like to see anyone succeed in that. It's very hard to do that for too long. It's like sitting there and just doing nothing and saying, okay, I'm not going to do an aveda. The best way is to get so busy with something, iskashus shel kedusha, so b'meili you don't have the yesod of klippah, which is this challenge. And it was an interesting impact on them. And I said, you have to find something you love to do. It could be kedusha, or the Alter Rebbe says, not necessarily kedusha, but definitely not klippah, but something you're really committed to. The more you have a passion that's positive, the less the passion will be in things that are negative. And obviously the ultimate goal, I said, is that you will marry one day and you'll use this kayach the Eibishter gave you in the right place. That's the key. Iskashus and Yesod in Kedusha, that is connected with a nekeva, with a wife, in a Kedushin and a sacred. Anyway, I could talk more about the whole fabrengen we had, but it was interesting reactions that were, I thought, quite positive. Al Kaponim, going a little over time here. So we covered Yesod. I will, let's see, next week maybe I'll make a few words about Yesod and Das, or we'll move to Malchus, I'll decide. By next week I'll have a decision. Okay, everyone have a good day.